Good morning. My name is Cynthia Arnson. I'm the director of the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center, and it is my pleasure to chair this panel that has been organized by my colleagues in the Mexico Institute, Andrew Seeley, Rob Donnelly, Katie Putnam, and Eric Olson, who is a consultant to the Mexico Institute on security matters. The problem of surging crime and violence and narco-trafficking in Mexico has been very much on the front pages of U.S. papers over the last months. Mexico faces a deepening and expansion of this problem. It is certainly not the only country to have faced a severe and sustained threat by organized crime. The purpose of this panel is to reflect on some of the experiences around the world, both in individual countries such as Colombia and in multilateral institutions such as the United Nations, to see what strategies have been put into place, what has been effective, what has been tried elsewhere. We have with us a distinguished set of panelists that Eric will later introduce, but I'll just give you a brief summary of the topics that they will be covering. Doug Farrow, who I think is a well-known face here in Washington, a former Washington Post correspondent, has been following questions of organized crime and its connection to terrorism for some years, and he will be talking about money laundering and how that intersects with organized crime. He will be looking specifically at Colombia and also the changing patterns of bulk cash transfers in Mexico. Aldo Civico, originally from Italy and from Sicily, is now at Columbia University and will focus on the Italian experience and also the experience of the city of Medellin in Colombia in reducing and transforming the violence and conflict in those cities. Vanda Felba-Brown from the Brookings Institution has extensive experience looking at South Asia and will look at what strategies have been used in those countries that might be useful to consider in the Mexican case. Vanda is also the author of a recent publication on Mexico that includes a section on organized crime, which I hope, if she hasn't brought copies to share with us, she'll indicate where people can get their hands on that report. Finally, Luis Astorga will be talking about the United Nations processes in combating organized crime and drug trafficking, the number of meetings that have been underway in the UN system, including one that continues this week in Vienna. I'm delighted again that with the number of you that have come to reflect with us on how Mexico and other countries in Latin America and throughout the world can address a very severe and challenging problem. I'd now like to turn the mesa over to Eric Olson. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thrilled to see so many of you here. I think it's an indication of the interest level in this topic that our RSVP list lit up within 24 hours, and we had to find and search for a bigger room. And we did a quick count yesterday that there will be 7 hearings in Congress in 2 weeks on the topic of violence on the border, organized crime, the Medellin Initiative, and Latin America generally. So I don't think in the 20-some years I've been in Washington working on these issues there's ever been a 2-week period when there's been that much attention and focus on the troubles in the region and people in Congress asking what should, could, would the United States do to be helpful. Maybe that's a good thing there's that much focus. Some people think maybe it's not such a good thing. But I do think it's an extraordinary time to look at this very complex issue of organized crime, try to gain some broader perspective on the issue. Latin America, Mexico, and the United States are intimately tied together, and it's a high-stakes. And so it's important that we try to look at other experiences around the world and really trying to find some of the keys to success or if not keys to success, what really doesn't work, so that make progress quickly and try to restore some order on this issue. I also wanted to welcome special members here today from the U.S.-Mexico Security Cooperation Working Group. We had a day-long meeting yesterday, and they are joining us this morning, so welcome to them as well. We're going to start off our panel with Doug Farah. He's already been introduced briefly, has written extensively on the illegal economies, money laundering, written a great book on illegal money laundering in Africa, and so we're asking him to focus on that and get us started. Thanks, Doug.
Is this on already?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Great, thank you. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for the introduction. I thought I think it's important because a lot of us throw the term money laundering around without actually knowing what money laundering is or some of the mechanics of it. So I thought it might be useful to look a little bit at some of the mechanics of what this actually means and then get into some of the main typologies that you see in our region and why I think that the ability to clamp down on those is severely limited. I think you have to start from the premise that drug trafficking generates more money than we can ever hope to put against it if you use the paradigm of a war on drugs. You simply can't. We're being outspent, 50 to 1 without any question, and so looking at the resources, I think, are important and how to get at them. And I think basically in my thinking, in my current work, we've come to sort of an impasse on what's doable in this field that will make any significant difference. I'd like to start by, if you look at how narco trafficking works, the money is collected in the consuming countries. Primarily, in this case, we'll look at the United States. So in every major city, and Mexican organizations are now in more than 200 cities, you have massive amounts of money in small bills that's collected as people buy drugs. And that money then has to get back to either Colombia or Mexico or points in between to be of use to the people who are providing the drugs. So you have this multi-billion-dollar transfer that has to take place. And the idea has always been, although I think it's a little less now, to make that money appear legally generated so that you can then declare that you legally earned this money and be exempt from problems with the military or with the law. So I'd like to look at one typology which I think has probably been the most successful long-term one, which we still see going on today to an enormous degree. And it's called the black market peso exchange. And if you all know this, I apologize for boring you, and if you don't, you might find it a little bit interesting. Essentially what happens with this is largely a Colombian mechanism because Colombia has not dollarized to near the degree that Mexico and Central America have. So you have pesos that need to be spent in Colombia. It's much more difficult to spend dollars there still than it is elsewhere. And essentially people have to collect billions of dollars in the United States. Say you're in Chicago and I'm a drug trafficker and I collect $20 million. I want to move that $20 million back to Colombia in a usable form so that I can get at it. There are a series of people called peso brokers. They sit around the major cities and they bid on the lots of money that are accumulated. You might tell me, I can move your money to Bogota in 10 days at a cost of $2 million. Someone else might say, well, I can do it for $8 million, but it would take me 15 days. And there's a bidding process that goes on, and then I select who I want to move my money back. Essentially, at that point, the broker who assumes the responsibility for moving the money is responsible for that money. He has to make good on the amount he told me he would deliver, whether he gets that money through or not. But he builds in a profit margin, or she builds in a profit margin, 10, 15%. So if it's $20 million, they have to give me, at the end of the day, $18 or $16 million. What they do with the margin in between is their business, and that's of no concern to me. So what do they want to do? They want to get me my pesos quickly. So they look to anything that will be able to be sold quickly on the streets of Colombia. One of the primary mechanisms is cigarettes, Marlboro cigarettes. Electronics, massive amounts of electronics. You have the whole phenomenon, those of you who know Colombia, of the San Andresitos, where you have massive markets of electronic goods and almost everything else that doesn't pay taxes. That's a direct result, first, of criminal or of smuggling activities that goes back centuries, but greatly exacerbated by the drug trafficking phenomenon. So what has happened to the Colombian economy over time as this has developed. If I want to come in and I can sell my Marlboro cigarettes at a discount, cheaper than the legal person can ever possibly sell them, because basically I don't care if I make a profit or not. I just want to unload it quickly to get the money to you and make something of a profit, but I'm not looking at making 2 or 3. I can sell it at a loss as a narco. Doesn't matter. So what do you see in Colombia? You see the massive sale of Marlboro cigarettes, all smuggled in through the Guajira Peninsula. They come largely from Aruba. If you look at Aruba's legal imports of cigarettes, they'd have to, every man, woman, and child would have to be smoking something like 300 cigarettes a day to match the legal import of what they bring in there. But that all goes to Colombia. And then if you've been to Bogota, Medellin, Cali, you see the kids selling Marlboro cigarettes on the streets all the time. You can buy them by the pack, you can buy them by 2s or 3s. Essentially, they want to turn that money over very quickly. So the legal sales of Marlboro in Colombia are tiny. They're about 8% of the market. Why they even get 8% is beyond me. Because you can buy the illegal ones far cheaper, so nobody buys the legal cigarettes. It's the same with electronics. You can buy, plasma 40-inch TV screens cheaper in the San Andresitos in Bogota or Medellin than you can in Miami or at other duty-free places. Why? Because profit is not the motive here. Profit is not what you're looking for. You're looking for a quick turnover to get your money, to get your cash in hand and come back. And so what has this done to Colombia but undermine the legal economy in ways that they can't possibly compete? I had a good friend whose job was providing catering services to the oil companies as they built pipelines. Her profit margin was 3 or 4%. But she was paid in cash largely because that's what her business did. And the narcos figured out that was a really nice cash business, came in, underbid her by 10 or 15%. She couldn't possibly compete. She knows they're not making any money. But that converts that money into pesos very quickly for them to be able to spend in Colombia. And so I think if you look at sort of the economic structure and long-term damage, it's both huge and it destroys your legal economy over time. And that's one of the huge consequences of this on a non-narcotic scale, simply on an economic scale. The other thing you see increasingly now, because of the dollarization, I would say it's an ongoing effect of globalization. El Salvador is now dollars, Panama's dollars, Mexico is largely dollarized, although not legally so, the dollar is obviously not their currency, but you can spend dollars much more easily in Mexico than you could before. And so what do you find the narcos wanting to do more and more is there's been some pressure on the formal financial structures. Reporting requirements have become, if you talk to the Mexican bankers, rather onerous, and I would argue they probably are. I mean, if you're reporting down to the levels that they're now required to legally report, either you don't do it, which a lot of them don't, or you do it and you run yourself into the ground trying to keep records that essentially no one ever has time to look at. It's the same problem we've had with FinCEN in the United States, which is the financial arm of, investigative arm of the Treasury Department here after 9/11 when they were worried about terrorist money. All of the banks started filing on everything, and they simply overwhelmed the system with paper so that if there was anything suspicious, no one would see it for 6 months, and by that time it was so long gone that there's no point in even thinking about it. So the bureaucratization of the reporting requirements is a serious problem, but they found it much easier just to move bulk cash back. And the problem with one of the things I think that's not that well understood about the Mexican narco process is that, yes, Mexico gets a lot of money in, billions of dollars, probably between $15, $20 billion a year in, but that's not money that largely stays in Mexico. 80% of that goes to buy product in Colombia or elsewhere again. That moves out fairly quickly, and that's all dollars. And the money moves in the same way that illegal immigrants come across. It's the reverse pipeline effect. You have people coming this way. You have guns and bulk cash shipment going that way. You have people and drugs coming this way, obviously, and money and weapons going back through the exact same pipelines using the same people, the same brokers, and that over time, to me, is the big danger. If you look at the terrorist overlap with drug trafficking, is that all of these people are now using the same brokers and the same people to move across borders and do things, and I think that's an increasingly dangerous proposition. But you see, it's very difficult now because Mexico, you can do so many things in dollars that you couldn't even 5 or 10 years ago. It's very difficult now to get a handle on that, and as the pressure has been brought to bear on the little folks who do the money remittances in smaller towns, et cetera, and they were legally reported to require, et cetera. And what do you see? You see the large U.S. remittance companies coming in like Western Union, and instead of charging 3 or 4%, they'll charge 1%. So you now have the undercutting of one of the few poorly regulated but somewhat regulated money transmittal systems also sort of being greatly jeopardized. The sale of used cars is huge as a money laundering mechanism in Mexico on the border. You see, you can bring in legally 2 cars a year. You see people paying other people, little old ladies who can't drive, 6-year-old boys who shouldn't drive if they do, to put their cars in their names and bring them across. But if you do that over time, you can accumulate millions of dollars. And a lot of that money either is then turned into pesos, but you can also buy huge amounts. You can buy large properties now. The luxury vehicle business is booming, especially in the major drug trafficking areas. Obviously one of the favorites is the Hummer now. You see 30% of the sales in some parts of the country are now Hummers, largely paid for in cash. It's supposed to be illegal to pay for them in cash. You're supposed to report it and do it, but I've talked a lot to the sellers themselves, and they'll tell you that they don't actually do that very often, because who's going to turn down $50,000 in cash for a Hummer especially when the economy looks like it does now. And so you have all these, as the financial system has been placed under stress and regulation. You used to have large amounts of money. You used to be able to walk into a bank with $2 million and put it in an account, and that was very easy. As the stress has been put on, you've had this fracturing of the money movement system, which ultimately means that the money gets through at a much higher cost. People have to pay now a lot more people along the way to get their money through. And they end up themselves with much less. And this is one of my arguments in the work I do with the U.S. government, that it's clear that the Mexican cartels are very rich. Nobody's saying they're not making piles and piles of money. But they also have massive expenses now that they didn't have before. And I think you see this. So I don't think the cartels are accumulating the massive economic wealth that Pablo Escobar was able to do, or the Cali cartel, the Rodriguez Orejuelas and the Northern Valley folks were able to, because they didn't have the wars amongst themselves. They didn't have to buy corruption across 3 political parties in Mexico instead of 1 with the demise of the PRI as the unitary party. You have what they call the democratización of the corruption process, where the drug money is now coming in much earlier into the primary process as narcos seek to cover their bets for whoever might win, because they no longer know that the PRI is going to win. And they have massive expenses on weapons, largely which they're buying, as has finally been percolating into the news cycle and into the policy discussion a little bit. The weapons that move from our border across into Mexico and are the primary weapons used by the drug traffickers. So if you look at it, it's sort of like an army of ants now. Instead of being able to deposit, like say $3 million in one chunk, you can buy 16 cars. You might have to do several other smaller things. Eventually you'll get your money in, and eventually you'll move it out. But your profit margin is diminishing. And I would argue that ultimately that's a good thing. And that may be in many ways the best we can hope for in dealing with this amount of money, is to raise the cost so that it's simply not as lucrative over time, and give them all the economic power that they used to have and erode it over a period of time. In looking at how to deal with this, I'll tell you a personal story just because I think it's so illustrative of how these things go and how both our intelligence community and our law enforcement community looks at things, or what happens in this process. I was, in the early 90s, asked to do a big series on money laundering for the Washington Post when I was still there. And I knew people in the Cali cartel who did handle their money, and so I went down and I talked with them, and Alfredo knows, they'll go and they'll talk to their bosses and see if it's okay to sort of talk to you. And they came back, and the guy was willing to talk. And so they walked me through this whole money cycling process that they do, and where they took it, and who did what, and blah, blah, blah. And I was writing my notes like crazy, and I published this 2-part series with Steve Collin. Everybody loved it. Oh, this was magnificent stuff. And law enforcement was like, wow, this is brilliant. And I'm not the brightest bulb on the chandelier sometimes. And after a while, I thought, why the hell did he tell me any of this stuff? This is really kind of strange. So I went back to I saw him a little while later, and I said, Harold, why are you telling me this stuff? And he looked at me and said, are you really like that stupid? And I said, what? And he said, I told you stuff that we'd already stopped doing 6 months ago. He said, you didn't know any of it, so I thought, we could tell you. He said, you were happy, right? Your editors were happy, everybody loved it. And I said, yeah. He said, if I told you what we were doing now, they'd kill me. I mean, of course, you're an idiot. But what I knew was far ahead of what most in the law enforcement community knew at that point, and yet it was far behind what reality was. And I think, again, that that's one of the things that we struggle with in the money trail, is that, especially in the era of globalization and electronic transfers and smart money cards and all those things that make it impossible to trace money, or the ability to move money incredibly quickly, is we are way, way behind the curve. And, it took the DEA 5 or 6 years to unravel the basic structure of the black market peso exchange with people working on it. And I know the guy who sort of, at the end of the day, said, ta-da, this is the theory of the case, and it held up. And it was a big deal, and it was important. But it had been going on, and all they do is vary the product and move their money through. So I think that the way I come down to this is that we're not going to take their money away in significant ways unless we get really lucky and do big hits on cash, as we occasionally do. And you do have to raise the cost over time of their ability to move this money and cut into their profit margins, which cuts into their ability to corrupt moderately and cuts into their ability to arm themselves. But on a long term, let's cut off the flow of drugs and money. I just don't think, given the volume of profit that this particular trade generates, that we're going to have a huge amount of success. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Let's turn now to Vonda Felba-Brown to talk a bit about the unique nature of violence in Mexico and drawing some lessons from some of the countries of Asia.
Thank you. When Eric first approached me to join the panel and talk about Asia, I thought, sure, I spend a lot of my time thinking about security issues in Asia and about illicit markets there, and I give many talks on counterinsurgency and narcotics in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But when I actually started preparing the talk, I realized that it's not so easy, because the Mexican market and the Mexican situation is in many ways quite unique and quite an aberration in the context of illicit markets. And really the closest analogy, in my view, is what was happening in Colombia in the 1980s and 1990s. And Cynthia was already kind enough to mention my paper, which I'll shamelessly advertise again. I brought flyers for it, where I really talk about the comparison between Colombia at the time and Mexico. And I also go in great details in recommendations about what I think should be done in Mexico today. And I won't get to it in my talk, but I'll briefly sketch why the Mexican market is an aberration today, and what lessons Asia can bring about what can be achieved, but also the great limits on interdiction and on dealing with crime organizations. Doug already talked about the very significant economic cost that large-scale illicit economies bring to countries in undermining the legal economy in various ways. They also sometimes boost legal economies by generating various spillover effects. This is true for labor-intensive illicit economies, such as cultivation of poppy or coca, but it's also true for labor-non-intensive illicit economies like smuggling, which also have positive spillover effects that encourage legal businesses as well. And I think we see it today in Sinaloa, for example, in Coachan, where people suggest that maybe 20% of the economy is related to smuggling. And that makes it all the more difficult to act against these economies. But in my view, really the biggest cost for Mexico today is clearly the level of violence. We heard that over 6,000 deaths last year resulted from the war on drugs and the inter-cartel violence. And this is truly unique. It's higher than the total levels of casualty in Iraq last year. It's higher than the total levels of casualties in Afghanistan. It's 6 times higher than the common denominator, the common marker for civil war, which is usually 1,000 deaths per year. And it is an aberration, really anomaly within the context of illegal markets. They are usually not this violent, including in the drug market. Violence is always a component of illegal markets, and I can explain why in the Q&A, but rarely on this scale. Because it's bad for the business. It's bad, including for the illegal business, where the transaction cost, not simply in terms of money, but in terms of procedures, are excruciatingly high. And we hear a lot today talk about is Mexico a failed state? And I think that's an inappropriate characterization. Obviously, the state in Mexico is quite strong, especially when compared to many other states in Latin America. But the illegal market is highly reminiscent of illegal markets in very disturbed countries. You can think about Afghanistan in the early 1990s before the emergence of the Taliban. And in my view, the illegal market is really begging for an emergence of an arbitrator, a regulator, that will bring some reduction in violence and reduction in transaction costs. And I'll speak a little bit in a minute about how I think such an arbitrator could emerge and what are the implications for the state and the society in Mexico. But let me just preface the rest of my comments here by saying that there are three separate policy issues that are frequently mixed in the policy debate. And I think that's counterproductive analytically as well as policy-wise. The three separate questions are, how do we reduce the drug trade and consumption in the U.S.? Second, how do we reduce trafficking in Mexico? How do we either eliminate it or reroute it back to the Caribbean or maybe through Canada? And third, how do we reduce the drug violence in Mexico? And the answer to the first question is we need to address global demand, which we have not done in the US, we have not done it in the North more broadly, but it's been equally neglected throughout the world, including in Latin America, including in Mexico. And this will have good spillover effects for the other two questions. But short of that, rerouting the drug trade from Mexico is very hard because the border is just so convenient and the US is such a dominant market. And yes, we could imagine how it could go back to the Caribbean or to Canada, much to the high costs of these countries, obviously. But I would argue that the border will just stay a very large magnet. So the real question, in my view, is how do we reduce violence in Mexico? And that now brings me to how I think an arbitrator could emerge on the market. So there are at least four different ways how violence could go down and how an arbitrator on the illegal market could emerge. The first is what normally happens when illicit markets become disturbed. State intervenes and removes a trafficking organization or an important capo, therefore start inner wars within the organization start, and there is some reaction against the state. And over time, just like in international relations, there is a redistribution of power, and several organizations emerge, 1, 2, 3. They have very good control through their territory, substantial influence outside, and then divide the turf anew. Mexico went through this in the mid-1990s, where we had first state actions against the market that changed the market, and many countries have gone through this. So this could happen in Mexico. Sometimes, though, and quite frequently, when markets are disturbed like this, you see the emergence of an outside actor. The Taliban in the 1990s that takes over the trade, or the paramilitaries in the mid-1990s that really managed to very substantially take over the trade in Colombia after the demise of the Medellin and the Cali cartel. And the unique thing about Mexico is that the insurgents groups who have existed there for many decades have really not been capable of systematically penetrating the trade. They peddle a bit, but they have not been able to take over the trade in the same way that insurgents have been able to do elsewhere in the world. The second mode that's quite linked to the first one is that the state prevails. And the state doesn't prevail in the sense that it would eliminate crime, but it brings crime down to reasonable levels. Violence is done, takes place mainly on an infrequent basis within the organizations, does not threaten public safety, and does not generate such paralyzing levels of violence that we see in Mexico today. No, so it's crime like in the United States or in Western Europe, for example. Now, unfortunately, Mexico today is paradoxically in the situation that the more the state intervenes right now, I think, the more it's likely to stimulate turf battles both within and among the organizations as well as among the state. And so I just don't see how easily we can escape right now substantial levels of violence for a while. And after a while, the organizations, hopefully much smaller, much less powerful, would again arrive at controlling cities, controlling certain routes. The third possibility is to see the reemergence of the corporatist model that Mexico had in the 60s, 70s, that Luis Astorga wrote a lot about, and I highly encourage you to read his writings on that, and that we have seen in other parts of the world, and I'll talk about it in Asia. And fourth, and very dangerously, the state could retract and really yield control to the crime organizations or possibly other groups. And not simply in the sense of vacating territory in a physical, spatial sense, but vacating administrative duties. So, for example, a police department, police chief and all his officers could only be appointed with the consent of the drug organization. And in my view, we already have some components of this in Mexico. We could see much more of that, and that would be, in my view, highly dangerous, and would set up really bad difficulties to manage the organizations in the future. So how does Asia, what lessons can we draw about Asia, from Asia? And let me also actually add here that there are two components of the drug trade or illicit markets in Mexico. One is, of course, the traffic and the associated violence, and that's what everyone for good reasons, focuses on. The other is still cultivation of illicit crops, which is quite substantial. I mean, last year, over the past 10 years, Mexico cultivates between 15 and 20,000 hectares of poppy. That's the same level that Thailand did at the peak of production in Thailand. Actually, it's even more than that. Eradication wipes out about 2/3 of that, but still it's a very substantial level of cultivation. And on cannabis, it's between 20 and 30,000 hectares. This is not insubstantial amount of cultivation at all. And eradication has been the sole and dominant approach. And in fact, in many ways, eradication has been a very good excuse for Mexican law enforcement, which is very corrupt, as we all know, to focus on eradication and really not deal with the trafficking organizations. And eradication also allowed law enforcement to maintain the corporatist model, because the best place to be as a drug trafficker is to be in charge of law enforcement. And eradication is a godsend to traffickers very frequently. It raises prices. I can explain it in the Q&A why it is such a convenient tool. So I'll talk about when has eradication efforts in Asia now been effective. And there are two models. One model is the mailed fist eradication. That's China after Mao, and that's Burma in the 1990s. In each case, the state goes, or state authorities go through a period where they try to eradicate in the context of violence, and they fail. And this tremendously antagonizes the population, and they give up. And at some point, though, they manage to take over the state. The junta in Burma makes arrangements with the various insurgencies, gives them, negotiates peace deals with them. One mechanism that they use is to promise them to trade with anything, including with drugs. And they signed up, and poppy grows very happily in Burma, and there is peace. In the case of China, Mao Mao trades and tolerates poppy while he's trying to take over power, but then he comes to power. And now he has the capacity, has full control, and he has the capacity to act, and he is willing to act completely ruthlessly. And it is the most successful eradication campaign in history, where he wipes out, maybe, by some estimate, 16, the amount of cultivation that would have generated 16,000 tons of opium. Incredible numbers. And of course, he's willing to use repression that kills thousands, millions of people, sends them into labor camps. In Burma, after the junta signs these deals, it comes under very serious pressure from the US and from China to act against poppy. And at this point, the insurgents have been disarmed, And they are now quite happy trading with various things. And so under pressure from both the junta, now having no means to resist violently, they agree to conduct eradication. And again, they have very good control throughout their territories. They're extremely brutal, and they can impose very effective eradication at the cost of massive starvation, excruciatingly abject poverty for the population. But there is no accountability, so they can do that. And it's largely holding in Burma. We see some increases in cultivation, but not much. And to a large extent, this is of course due to the total overproduction in Afghanistan, which I can talk about in Q&A. So here's one very brutal model where eradication managed to bring cultivation down in specific locales, if not globally. Asia also offers the one model of success of alternative livelihoods programs that have been successful at eliminating cultivation on the countrywide level, and that's Thailand. The effort took about 30 years. It was extremely well designed, well funded, had a serious commitment of the state, was really conceived as a rural development program that was much broader than simply alternative livelihoods, but had crucial socioeconomic components, including citizen rights for the minority hill communities that were cultivated. It was a very effective, really quite a model program in my mind. But the two caveats are that Thailand also faced very auspicious circumstances. First of all, the peak production was only 18,000 hectares. Paltry when we compare it with Pakistan in the 1980s or more currently Afghanistan. And also Thailand was one of the Asian tigers. The entire economy grew massively and changed demographics, opened up a lot of space opportunities in agriculture. But I wanted to bring in the illicit cultivation component because, in my view, there is an opportunity for Mexico and an underemphasized component of counter-narcotics. The US, for example, does not fund alternative livelihoods in Mexico at all. And the level of cultivation is fairly small. The distances are not very high. This is not Nariño or Putumayo or Arauca in Colombia, where doing alternative livelihoods is extremely difficult, and it's hard to imagine how it could work. But this is not the case in Mexico. And the economic crisis and its reverberations among the poor segments of Mexican society, I think, will push more people into cultivating. And this will only strengthen the trafficking organizations. Let me say a little bit briefly about interdiction efforts in Asia and efforts to suppress crime organizations. The success here is far smaller. And all the countries that succeeded in wiping out cultivation or suppressing it usually did not succeed in eliminating trafficking. And very frequently, the state adopted a corporatist model that went even much further than the one in Mexico, where the junta really completely absorbed the drug trafficking, the main drug traffickers like Kunsa, like Usailin, and used their money to completely consciously support the legal economy, build ports, support the military. Something similar went on in China in the 20s with the very famous Green Gang and Du Yuasheng and the Chiang Kai-shek government. And when the state succeeded in breaking the cartels or breaking the trafficking organizations, it usually did so with extreme force. This is, Mao, and this is China in the 1990s when they acted against the Chinese traffickers along the Burmese border. And in conclusion, frequently interdiction efforts have resulted in eliminating small-scale traffickers and only giving rise to solidifying and more powerful drug trafficking organizations. This is the outcome of our interdiction efforts in Afghanistan over the past 8 years. And this is exactly the opposite of what interdiction should do. I think interdiction is very important, and its goal should be to break up groups into good number of very small groups that don't have much coercive capacity and that are not capable of generating paralyzing levels of violence in Mexico. And if you want to know how I think it could be done in Mexico, read my paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fada. Let's turn now to Aldo Civico, who is the director of the Columbia University Center for International Conflict Resolution. He was the senior advisor to Leoluca Orlando, the former mayor of Palermo in Sicily, and has also been very involved in field work and writing and studying and thinking about organized crime in Colombia, and he now is an informal advisor to the former mayor of Medellin, Sergio Fajardo. Aldo.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Eric, Cynthia, for your work. I'm here to share with you the lessons learned of two cities that for many years have been identified with figures like, in the case of Palermo, Totorina and Cosa Nostra, and in the case of Medellin with Pablo Escobar. And I had the, I think, great fortune in my life to witness the process of transformation of these two great cities and to be close with the two figureheads who led the political process that allowed the change to happen. Leluc Orlando in Palermo and Sergio Fajardo in Medellin. And many today think that I'm Colombian, and I'm not, or many think that I'm Sicilian, and I'm not. I come from a very small town in northern Italy. And when I was about 16 years old, I remember watching news, and there was a prominent Italian journalist interviewing a mayor from Palermo. And this mayor of Palermo was actually speaking up against Mafia, and he was also denouncing the connections between Mafia and politics. And for me, this was very strange. How was it possible for a mayor of Palermo speaking up against the Mafia? Because for us in the north, the imagery was that if you are a mayor in Palermo, then you are a spokesperson of Cosa Nostra, you are a spokesperson of the Mafia. And therefore I thought, well, either this man is a big and a good liar, because he looked very convincing, or he's a little bit crazy. And I got to know Leluc Orlando very well, and I can tell you that he's not a liar, maybe a little bit crazy. So this is why I decided later on, and of course when I was 16 I would not imagine that, when I was 22 years old I decided to do exactly the contrary of what the migration current does in Italy, which is from south versus the north. I from north went down south because something very important was happening and wanted to give it a close look. So Palermo and Medellin have similar problems. You have first a deep social inequality. You have also deep-rooted violence. And you have the presence of an organized crime organization like the Mafia. Now, the Mafia in Italy has always been described in terms of metaphor as an octopus with so many tentacles that would reach out into politics, into economy, into the judiciary. So it was certainly always described and understood as an external threat, an external reality that also generated a system of endemic corruption. And I think also when we think of cases like Mexico or Colombia, increasingly we have to think, how do we fight endemic corruption? Not so-called normal corruption where you have a few individuals that accept bribes, but when corruption is actually a system of power and of doing economics. Another characteristic of a mafia is that mafia always comes with adjectives. You don't have the mafia in general. You have Sicilian mafia, you have the Colombian mafia, the Mexican mafia, the Russian mafia. And it is because it is very enculturated in the values, in the attitudes of a specific location and reality. And therefore, mafia is, I describe it also as an internalized reality. Because it shapes ways of thinking, it shapes way of living and of acting. It is an orientation of life. And therefore, when you want to fight this kind of endemic problems that have also cultural ramification, you have to change the orientation of people's attitudes and values. So repression, therefore, in these cases is not enough. It's certainly important, but it's not enough because it's not, let's say, normal crime. We are not fighting the robbery of banks. It's something which is much more deeper and comprehensive. And therefore, Palermo and Medellin, I think, are interesting because besides sharing similar patterns of problems, they also share strategies of solution when you confront this kind of problem. And so the how, if I have to summarize the how of Palermo and Medellin, well, the how was also how we fight mafia, and it is by changing the way politics was done. And with the results, in Medellin, in 1991, you had a peak of 381 assassinations for every 100,000 residents. In 2007, then Mayor Sergio Fajardo finished his term as a mayor. The rate was 26. In Palermo, during the administration of Leoluc Orlando, Moody gave actually a AAA as a rating for foreign investment in public works, which meant that it was safe and it was corruption-free. So let's see a little bit what was the framework of this model of using politics, the political process, in order to fight organized crime. The image that Leoluc Orlando has been using is that of the Sicilian cart. The Sicilian cart is a cart with two wheels. And he always said, well, one wheel is the wheel of law enforcement, of repression. But the other wheel is the wheel of culture. And that has to promote a culture of lawfulness, of human rights, of democratic participation. And the two wheels need to move at the same speed so that the car can move forward. And so this is how he started working, was not only by supporting the work of very courageous judges. I was in Palermo in the years when Falcone and Borsellino were killed, but also by promoting the participation of citizens and opening up the space to citizenship. An example, the City Hall. The City Hall in Palermo has been for decades the symbol of the power of Cosa Nostra. It was a building, a palace that was closed to citizens. Well, one very even physical and very visual thing that Leoluc Orlando did was by opening the doors to citizens of the City Hall. Transforming, for example, the big room of the city council in a room for conferences talking about mafia. Now, you have to think that the word mafia was not spoken in Palermo. And it was certainly not spoken in the palace of politics. Opening up the city council to citizens to discuss mafia, to actually utter the word and define it and decline it, was actually a very strong, send a very strong message to the entire city. Many NGOs were brought up over the years trying to address the problem of mafia, and they were always at the margins, not considered or even opposed by politics. Well, Leoluc Orlando gave them offices within the city hall. This sent also another very important message. Basically, it was about reclaiming the public sphere, a public sphere that previously was completely corrupted and privatized by the mafia. It was regaining it and giving it back to its owners without the citizens. Medellin, in 2003, Sergio Fajardo was elected as a mayor. He started his tenure in 2004, and he had a similar model, maybe not the image of a Sicilian cart, but he used certainly law enforcement, police, in the city police. It coincided his period with the demobilization of the first very important paramilitary bloc in Colombia, the Cacique Nutivara. So elaborating, designing an effective strategy for reintegrating almost 5,000 former combatants has been another strategy to reduce violence and to reclaim space on behalf of the state in the city. And then by promoting a culture of citizenship, and having citizens committed in the different barrios of Medellin to the political process, for example, through the participatory process to decide part of money allocation of the budget. So I think that Palermo and Medellin give us an important lesson that before endemic problems, we don't have easy solutions. I think also in the case of Mexico, maybe the temptation is try to find the right recipe, trying to find the right policy that works. But the problem is a little bit more complicated than just trying to fix a broken car. And Orlando and Fajardo stories, in terms also of a trajectory of political career, tell us also that they were not isolated figures. They were actually expression of a very vast social and movement that then became a political movement. And I think that here there is also, in terms of fighting corruption, a very important lessons learned, because there was a sort of a pact between the politicians and the citizens. Politicians were called actually to be accountable towards the movement of citizens that brought them to power. And the other very important shift, I think, is that from civil society, some people actually entered the political process and influenced it and shaped it in different ways. So I think that when we look at endemic problems, certainly repression and effective repression has to be a necessary part of the game. But we have to look also at the way in which we create a sort of a different political culture that reorients the behavior, the values, and make the citizens have a completely different experience of what the state is and what democracy is about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aldo. Finally, let's hear from Luis Astorga. Luis is a professor at the Institute for Social Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He's written numerous books. I told him last night, the very first time I started thinking about drug trafficking and organized crime in Mexico, somebody handed me his book. It's kind of one of the original books on this topic in Mexico, written by a Mexican. He will talk some about that, but also the UN General Assembly process that's been underway for the last 10 years. There's an evaluation of the UN strategy, political declaration and action plan underway now, and the UN is about to set in place a new strategy for the next decade. So he has been a part of that process as well, and we'll talk some about what's happening at the UN or multilateral level. Thank you, Luis.
Thank you very much. I apologize for my English. I was supposed to talk in Spanish, and well, I'll do my best. When we talk about organized crime, and as the other colleagues said, we have to talk also about the way in which the crime is organized. I mean, you don't talk about organized crime in the absence of politics. You have to talk. You have to take into account the case of Italy, the case of Colombia, the case of Mexico, the field of politics, and how it is related to organized crime, and in particularly in these years to drug trafficking. The image we have when we talk about organized crime is, for example, Al Capone. That was the origin, in my view, of this kind of perception about organized crime and the things that these criminal groups could affect democracy in some states, or the possibility of governance in some others not democratic states. well, the preoccupations of states in the developing of these criminal groups finally states agreed in what is called the Palermo Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. The Palermo Convention on Organized Crime, who took place in Palermo, and my Italian colleague here, he knows better than me. Well, the aim of this Palermo Convention was to create a legal framework, a transnational legal framework, in order to contain, to attack, to have judicial tools in order to contain the organized crime. And there are each state has to, there is a liberty for each state to take into account its own judicial system, and to take into account also the general framework. How is how do you say ¿cómo se designa al crimen organizado?
How you define
it says how you define organized crime, and this definition, it's very simple. It's 3 or more persons who in a continuous way act or do something, some activities considered illegal, such as trafficking in persons, drug trafficking, money laundering, and so on. Why this convention? Well, it's well known, the capacity of drug trafficking organizations, but not only drug trafficking organizations, but in some countries, principally drug trafficking organizations, and also arms trafficking and some other crimes. The Palermo Convention. It's closely related to other tools developed by the United Nations, and for example, this year the General Assembly of the United Nations are delivering about evaluating the last 10 years of the drug policy in the world, and what it has to be done for the next 10 years. And when you talk about this, when you discuss, for example, drug politics, you have to take into account the Palermo Convention on organized crime. And the things that are being discussed in the General Assembly these days are about money laundering, drug consumption reduction of the demand of drugs, judicial cooperation, alternative development, trafficking in methamphetamines or chemical precursors, and as you can see, it's closely related to these groups that are developing in some countries with and there are that are very powerful. So how these conventions, United Nations conventions or agreements come down to particular states, and how they what kind of institutions or what kind of what kind of legal framework they develop in order to try to attack or to contain or to control criminal organizations, transnational organized groups. Well, each state has, as I said, the possibility of adapting these recommendations to its own legal framework. In most of the states, I would say, the definition of transnational organized crime is the same as the definition in the Palermo Convention. There are no changes in main changes in this legal framework. The differences are closely related to the history of each country and the way that organized crime was born, and the way that organized crime was related or not since the beginning with the political power. And for example, in the case of Mexico, which I would say it's more related to what has happened in Italy than what has happened in Colombia. It's more similar from my point of view. This relationship among the political field and the emergence of, for example, drug trafficking organizations, who are the most powerful groups of transnational organized crime in Mexico. You cannot understand this, what is happening right now, if you don't understand that since the beginning there was a close relationship, and drug trafficking field was born dependent on the political field. It was not born separated from the political field, and this dependence from the political field make us think about the changes in the political system in Mexico that are, from my point of view, the principal explanation of the raising in the violence and the raising in the internal market of drugs in Mexico. So in the last, I would say, 30 and something years, since the 1970s, drug trafficking organizations in Mexico, we have to say that when you talk about a transnational organized crime in Mexico, most people, almost everybody, is thinking about drug trafficking organizations. They're not thinking about organizations who who do arms trafficking or some other illegal business. The power that they have and they began to develop since the 1940s, but most clearly since the 1970s, create a preoccupation from the government of Mexico and the United States government, and with the tools of the Palermo Convention, in Mexico was created the law against what we call Ley contra la Delincuencia Organizada, law against organized crime, and it's the same, as I said, it's the same framework that was created in the Palermo Convention. So what had been the results of this application, particular application in the case of Mexico? If you take into account, for example, money laundering, we cannot say it has have very good results, as it hasn't have anywhere in the world, I would say. There are some things that have been done in developed countries, but we still have a lot of problems. And in the General Assembly these days in Vienna, what you can see is that there's a lot of things to do in this field. When you talk about demand reduction, well, you have to see what is happening in the United States, in Europe, and in some other countries that didn't have that problem some years ago. It's also a failure. You can see some. You can say there is some good news about the control of the chemical precursors, and but not in some other fields. Even though there are no good reasons to be optimistic in this with this kind of framework, it's the only one we have, and as we are watching in the General Assembly in Vienna these days, the main objective of the drug policy that is leading this that permits drug trafficking organizations to be more powerful is not going to be changed. Otherwise, I mean, if we could see any substantial changes in this drug policy, we could eventually see some reduction in drug-related violence and other crimes related to drug trafficking. And one of the objectives for the next 10 years, as it was one of the objectives 10 years ago, is to eradicate drugs from the earth. So you can see that there is this objective is not going to be attained. So I wouldn't be so optimistic about this kind of things, and I guess the countries that have more tools to lead with these tools are authoritarian states and developed democracies. Most of the problems we have with organized crime are in countries that are not authoritarian. They're in the process of democratization, and that's one of the reasons that the concentration of international community and the particular states is concentrated on consolidating a good security system and the how do you say, procuración de justicia, and the law enforcement system. Well, that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. We've gotten some, I think, very interesting, provocative ideas and suggestions of approaches to dealing with the problems of organized crime. We have about a half hour to ask the panelists questions. Oh, Cindy has a question.
No, I have a question, but I don't necessarily need to start.
Oh, okay. Katie has the mic. Would you please raise your hand? Katie will bring you the mic. Identify yourself. We'll take 3 questions to start.
Mary Beth Sheridan from the Washington Post. I have a question for Dr. Astorga. When you say that the increase in violence, the drug violence in Mexico, is linked to the changes in the political system in Mexico, can you explain that a little more? Because I'm frankly still confused about why drug violence has increased so much in Mexico. Thank you.
Cindy up here, and then
Cindy Arnson from the Wilson Center. My question is for Aldo. I'm wondering if there is anything about the pre-existing level of violence in Palermo or Italian culture, even in Sicily, that prevented the opening of political spaces from being met with a brutally violent response from the organized crime networks. You can certainly envision, you open City Hall that had been this symbol of Mafia power, and, someone walks in and just, machine guns a community meeting taking place. And my sense is that, given the totally grotesque and gruesome forms of killing it in Mexico, that experience may be difficult. The experience of Palermo may be difficult to transplant in a situation where the level of violence has already been so ratcheted up.
there were some questions way in the back. Travis also has a mic. Let's be fair to the folks that have been patient way back there. So if you wouldn't mind standing up and identifying yourself.
Hi, my name is Justine Lindemann. I work with the Africa program at the Wilson Center. I was wondering if one or more of the panelists could address the relatively recent emergence of West Africa as a huge conduit for drug transportation from Mexico and Latin America as a means to get the drugs from that region into Europe, and sort of address the question of a secondary economy that exists in many of these port cities such as Dakar and Abidjan and Lagos, and what that sort of introduces into the situation and how one might address it.
Why don't we get some responses to those questions, and we'll take another round. Do you want to try the West Africa one, Doug?
Well, I think that it's really interesting, and I think it speaks to the level of profitability of the drug trade. If you can move stuff across Colombia, across Venezuela, across the ocean, and then northward, and still make enough of a profit to make that worthwhile. I think what you're seeing, you have clearly identifiable Mexican organizations and the FARC in Guinea-Bissau, for example, and I think that's a disturbing trend to say the least. I think what is Dr. Astorga was saying, these groups tend to migrate to places where there isn't a good governance system already in place. And I told a friend of mine who was going over there to look, I said, if the narcos are there, you'll see two things. You'll see cars that are luxurious beyond belief in places that have no roads for them to drive on, in fancy whorehouses. And he came back and said, cars and fancy whorehouses. It must be drug traffickers. And that's what they bring with them. But I think the secondary economy issues of you're already dealing with weak states with systemic corruption problems, and I think this brings an order of magnitude difference in the level of corruption. You can see in Guinea-Bissau, the president's been assassinated, the minister of justice has been assassinated. In Sierra Leone, you've had serious other problems developing. You've had Red Cross planes supposedly planes painted as Red Cross being used to move tons of cocaine around. You have an undermining of what little of the very fragile rule of law may exist there, and a whole new level of corruption that I think will destroy these states very quickly if in fact they're not really, especially Guinea-Bissau is not a functioning state in and of itself anyway. It hasn't been for a long time, and this will create essentially a whole new frontier for moving in.
Fonda, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, just to add, I think it's just exemplary of how extremely footloose these economies are, and how the balloon effect that we have seen with respect to cultivation is equally prominent with respect to trafficking. And in fact, I would say that the efforts to suppress trafficking are even far less successful and far more difficult than dealing with cultivation in particular locales. And so then you have to ask yourself, from a strategic perspective, what is it that you want to accomplish with trafficking? Where is the threat of trafficking going to be greatest to either the United States, or where is it going to be greatest to the local society? And should we be simply engaged in attacking the problem at any place where it emerges, and if so, through what means? Or do we need to look at other means, which I would posit is looking at demand reduction? Now, I don't think that's a panacea. I think Doug was quite correct to talk about the cigarette smuggling business. It's a legal product, but it still exists in both legal and illicit forms. And trafficking organizations are usually rather flexible, and so are insurgent groups that get involved. I mean, there is somewhat of a mischaracterization and caricature to say that they traffic just with anything. That's not true. Frequently, the character of the organization will dictate what kind of goods or commodities or services they'll carry. But there is a great deal of flexibility. So simply say we are going to get rid of one illicit good doesn't mean that they'll collapse. They'll still exercise a lot of power. But I think we need to think much more strategically about what is it that we try to accomplish. Where are the least threats to our society and to the local countries? And what means are best available to get crime to levels that does not threaten the state and enhances human security?
Aldo?
Yeah, to Cindy's question. I think that to speak to values, one interesting thing I think of the Mafia phenomenon in Sicily was that it actually perverted very good Sicilian values: honor, family, friendship. Those are good values. But they became ownership of the Mafia, and they really perverted that into satanic verses, to remember Rushdie's kind of definition. There was also, because of the omertà, the law of silence, I don't see, I don't speak, and I don't hear, there was no opposition for decades against Mafia power. And that was enforced brutally. I mean, the Mafia violence in Sicily has been brutal and spectacular One practice was, for example, dissolving bodies in acids. So, you know, the 80s, you had a very strong mafia war among clans when then Totorina took over. That was very public in terms of executions and very brutal. The period of Leoluco Orlando has been defined as the spring of Palermo, but we have to think that that didn't happen overnight. That didn't happen because Leoluco Orlando was charismatic and was elected. That was actually a chapter of a long process that started at the beginning of the 70s. It was actually started by a Jesuit father who understood that a different leadership was needed in the country, and he started to train, if you want, young university students, Leoluco Orlando among them. Part of that strategy was to bring political participation into the peripheral barrios of Palermo. And that didn't happen without blood. At some point there were, for example, Piersanti Mattarella, governor of Sicily. He was from the Democrazia Cristiana, which in Sicily was a synonymous of mafia power. He was the first one who tried to break the links between the Democrazia Cristiana and Cosa Nostra, and he was killed. Rocco Chinichi was the first figurehead and somehow the founder of the pool of prosecutor that going after the Cosa Nostra in a very aggressive way. And at the beginning of the 80s, he was killed with a car bomb. So it was not a smooth, easy process. And I think that the lesson we learn is that you have to find ways in which you activate processes that allow for inclusion, also into the political process, but that also takes time. That you will have small results over time, but you will reach a critical mass that in the case of Palermo was the creation of a very thick network of positive leaderships, as we called it. That comes always and only over time. But at some point, you have to start this process.
Luis?
Okay. Mary Sheridan's question. I would say that in the case of Mexico, and in some other cases, it's not only the market, it's a new configuration of political power in the democratic transition process without the kind of institutions adapted to this process. In the authoritarian state, you have the PRI, as a Democracia Cristiana with Cosa Nostra. In Mexico, with the authoritarian state, you had PRI with drug trafficking organizations. But the power was in the side of the PRI, the hegemonic party, political party. Well, this kind of authoritarian state has disappeared. We don't have any longer this kind of state. We are in a process of a democratic transition. And the kind of institutions, the security and law enforcement institutions that we used to have with the PRI, they no longer exist. And in the process of the democratic transition, the political parties in Mexico haven't had an agreement to create the new institution for this transition and in order to consolidate these democratic institutions. So in this fragmentation of political power, the dependence that drug trafficking organizations used to have vis-a-vis the political power is completely how do you say se fragmentó? Fragmented. So it's more possible for them to try to control, for example, the whole police institution in one municipality, and try to control the security institution in some states, for example. not the whole institution, but the most important hierarchical positions in this institution. For example, the chief of police in one state or one municipality, and the people who work closely to this chief of police. Although, in other terms, drug trafficking organizations are competing with the state at the local and at the federal level, and they introduced some new modus operandi that didn't exist before in the case of Mexico. They introduced the Mafia strategies, and they introduced the Colombian paramilitary strategies, particularly what is called the Golfo organization, Tamaulipas organization, and the introduction of these particularities in the field of drug trafficking provoked that the other organizations are trying to do the same thing. So we have an increasing logic of paramilitarization of drug trafficking in Mexico, and maybe I like to think that it's not going to happen, but what we're watching right now is a close relationship between the most powerful paramilitary, the most powerful drug trafficking organizations that have the most important paramilitary capacity in Mexico. Those, those groups are the Zetas, the Carrillo Fuentes, and the Beltran Leiva brothers.
Let's take a couple more questions in the back, and then Maria Clara Costa had a question up here. Travis, can you help with the two in the back? And there's one up here.
Good morning. My name is Christina Lara, and I'm with the Inter-American Dialogue. And I had two quick questions. One was for Mr. Farah, and I was wondering about, you mentioned raising costs as a way to, the growing expenses for the cartels that are kind of making their operating costs more difficult. And is there anything that we can do on this side of the border to make that more expensive for them without affecting remittances and legal money flows? Is there anything that, would make their expenses go up based on what we could do in terms of policy? And second of all, my question was for Mr. Civico. And I'm wondering about the spaces in which cartels maneuver, especially in Mexico, because you speak a lot about what happened about Palermo and the Mafia culture, and I realize that's an urban space. In Mexico, I know that a lot of the trafficking exists in rural areas, especially the central area, like Zacatecas, as a state where a lot of trafficking flows through because there's so little civic engagement. There's a little, the political process there isn't the same as, it can't really be compared to a city. So is there a way that we could really compare changing the political structure in a place where it's already kind of lacking?
The gentleman next to you there, I think, if you turn that way, had a question.
Thank you very much. Shelton Davis. I'm at Center for Latin American Studies at Georgetown University. I was wondering if any of you know if the criminal organizations in Colombia and Mexico who are promoting drug production and trafficking are negatively affecting any of the indigenous peoples in their communities in these countries. And if they are affecting the indigenous communities, should we be promoting the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights in those countries, and also during this second decade of UN Decade of Indigenous Peoples?
Maria Clara is right there.
Hi, Maria Clara Costa from Mexico. I have a question for Aldo Civico about Colombia. Do you think the process, well, I mean, because you mentioned that the process in Medellin sort of coincided with the first demobilization of the paramilitary groups. Do you think that the whole enactment of the peace and justice law and the fact that people began to see a very, very watered down, but a measure of justice and the possibility of truth emerging of the terrible violence that took place in Medellin, do you think that that broader policy had an impact? Because I've been very struck by in Medellin, I mean, the amount of efforts that the local government has gone through to memorialize and to kind of bring to light the whole truth about the repression and the terrible violence that took place there. So there's a space for transitional justice in this process. Thank you. Thank you.
Doug, do you want to start out here?
On raising the costs, I mean, I think as has been said here already, lowering consumption and lowering the profits is probably the most effective way of getting at their financial structures. I think on this side of the border, we're starting to focus now more on the bulk money shipment phenomenon and ways to try to interdict that. It has to be an almost entirely human intelligence directed, driven process, and we're not that good at that at this point. And I think that the Mexicans are also becoming much more aware of this, and so I think that what's going to happen is they're going to move quickly into new modalities that we're not looking at yet, which is in itself is good. But I think that you occasionally get lucky, like with the Chino, where they got the $240 million at one whack. But that's an anomaly, and that they didn't know they were going to find that when they set out when they got into the guy's house and found his room stuffed with money. So you can't claim it as a great intelligence hit there. The other thing I think that goes the rising costs is these groups go after each other. I think one of the phenomena we've seen is the rise of the sicariato within the trafficking organizations, and I think, as you saw in Colombia as well, you go from a fairly significantly sophisticated group of people running the operation to a sicariato that only knows how to kill people, and their costs go way up because they're hiring, and as was said, the Zetas are now forcing everybody to arm and train and mobilize and buy weapons that they didn't have to do before. And I think that if it follows the Colombian model, that group will also disappear. They'll be killed off at some point, and probably, I would imagine, not too distant future. And you'll go back to a group of businessmen who are much more focused on making money than on disputing every little plaza and figure out how they can work together instead of having to kill each other to move product. So I think that some of this violence and the cost of that will diminish as in the natural course of cartel development, because I think that's what they do.
Do you have anything?
Yeah, on the indigenous people, yes. It's not just the case in Colombia; it's the phenomenon worldwide. But certainly in Colombia, many of the trafficking organizations, FARC, the paramilitaries, in many ways exploit and abuse indigenous communities. We see the same phenomenon in Brazil, where the indigenous people are isolated, frequently not aware fully of what they are doing, and they become mules for trafficking, for very small payments, but for them very large payments. And yes, the state needs to protect them. And this goes to one of the other questions about rural Mexico versus city Palermo. And I'll let Aldo deal with it. Let me just add here that to some extent, though, both are manifestations of a limited state. And I think that Cynthia hit on something very important when she asked about to what extent do you need permissive levels of violence. Violence is not as acute as it is right now for the state to be able to encourage institutional change and cultural change, and that's very important. But ultimately, the state needs to be present, crucial in the public safety sphere, which is the irreducible function of state. But it needs to move beyond that into having multifaceted presence, including in the socio-economic sphere. That's why I talked about about Thailand and the successes there in the very robust and comprehensive approach to state enlargements. And in the sense, I think that the Mexican case is not so different from Palermo, from Italy, where the manifestation of the Mafia was and the rise and its strength was very much a phenomenon of state that was very weak, very limited, and failed to provide essential necessities. And they gave rise to alternative forms of governance. And so while how you deal with the local settings will be extremely dependent on the local modalities, at the end of the day, you need multifaceted state presence that enhances human security, that delivers public safety, but delivers economic improvement and social integration and institutions that take care of the elemental needs of the population at minimum.
Yeah, I build up on what you just said in order to respond to Christina. I think we have to realize that, and this is why I always made an analogy between Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian Mafia, and in Colombia with the paramilitary, more than just the narco-trafficking kind of organization. Because what they share, I think, in common is that Mafia is at the same time against the state and inside the state. And therefore, this is the challenge on how to go about, and bringing the presence, the multifaceted presence of the state in the territories, I think is very crucial, and it's very important. Activating participatory forms of community and governance. I'll give you an example. In 2006, I traveled to an area in Colombia called Bajo Cauca, which is coca field-rich area. And when I got at the time in the town of Terrassa, what impressed me very much was that the hospitals as well as housing projects were built by the local narco-trafficker boss, Cuco Vanoy, who now sits in a jail here in the United States. And I happened to stay over for a couple of nights in the only motel that is there, and was owned also by Cuco Vanoy. And I was having breakfast in this hotel, and he was having breakfast, actually office hour, I would say, with just a couple of tables away from me. And so I just was observing this long line of people, and this was actually when the demobilization process was already ongoing in Colombia, and he was just talking and resolving problems of people like a mayor is supposed to do. And among the people that sat down with him was also the commander of the police. Right? And so I thought, first, I somehow I felt not sympathy, but some understanding towards the commander of his police. I thought he probably has also a wife and kids. And when Cuco Vanoy is the boss in town, what do you do against Cuco Vanoy? Unless you are, like my friend Leoluca Orlando, a little bit crazy, and you accept a life in an armored car, the chances to get killed or to send to another similar places are very high. So I think that in those areas, besides bringing multifaceted aspect of the state, the part of repression is also very important. And for that, what worked in the case of Italy is that you had a body of judges that were excellent, very dedicated, and not corrupt. And they created a pool that was able to go after mafia bosses, not after only the middlemen or the small fish in the barrio. That's easy. But they actually went against the mafia bosses and the politicians and the business people linked to the mafia. I think you need to start also with a repression, giving the signal that impunity is not an option and it's not a possibility in those areas as well. To the question about Medellin, yeah, it was, I think, many factors helped the process. One was the fact that the demobilization process actually allowed. Today it's very much discussed and it's actually criticized, especially from the opponents of Fajardo and the current mayor of Medellin, Alonso Salazar. But the demobilization process allowed for dialogues and negotiation with people who had power in the city. I think Fajardo was a realist, and he said, these people, starting with Don Berna, they control the city. When Don Berna was arrested, buses stopped for an entire day. So just an example of how capillary the power was. So the demoralization process actually allowed to sit down with these people and to negotiate and therefore to find problems reducing violence. Because if there was a problem in a barrio, you could go to the prison of Itagüí, sit down with Don Berna and say, here is this problem, and he would find a way to solve it. Maybe it's not, romantic, maybe we don't like it, but it was practical, pragmatic, and indeed it worked. And by reducing violence, they were able to enter with the state with all the facets that were just described, with education, with architecture, with housing projects, with social projects. What I think was also very important is that within the framework of the law and justice law, the city of Medellin gave visibility to victims through the Victims Project. They didn't give them money to victims, but they actually gave them space to be empowered, to learn skills, and to be able to share with the city their entire history. And people just discover what the city went through, because it might sound strange, but actually people did not always know what was going on. And I think that had a tremendous effect. There was even one of Alonso Salazar's ideas at one point was if a truth commission could be established just for the city. And I think we're still thinking about it. But the fact that you give not only attention and services to demobilized people trying to reintegrate, but you took care also of victims and of young people with other kinds of projects that did not end up in any armed group. I think that was part of a comprehensive approach and a successful one.
I'm sorry that we have run out of time. As often happens in these situations, the time is just not enough. Sometimes we end up with more questions than we started with, but in a way it's a good thing. You're helping us think through this very, very complex issue. And so please join me in thanking our panelists.